Hello. In this episode, I'm going to share with you 3 thoughts from Exodus 24, verses 3 through 8. Exodus 24, 3 through 8 says, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, All the words that the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel, who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in the basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. He took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people, and said, Behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. From Exodus 20 through 24, you have the laws that God placed before Israel. All these laws that were going to govern how they lived and how they dealt with one another. And when the people heard all of these laws, they heard it, they liked it, and they promised that they would follow it. Here are 3 thoughts from Exodus 24, 3 through 8. Thought number 1, God's law sounds good. When you hear God's law as a standard for behavior, you will say, yeah, that sounds right. Because what does God's law say? It says all the things that we know we ought to do. It says you should be fair with one another. We agree with that. It says you shouldn't take another person's stuff. You shouldn't kill other folks. If you happen to be responsible for somebody else getting hurt, you should make restitution for that. All of that sounds good to us. God's law sounds good. When you read it as a moral system, you'll sit back and say, yeah, this all seems pretty fair. God's law sounds good. Thought number 2, we want to follow God's law. Because God's law sounds good, when we hear it being said, we will sit back and we will say, yes, I want to do that. I want to follow God's law. Because when I hear it, I know that what it's describing is the way that I should behave and the way that I want other people to behave towards me. God's law is something that I want to follow, and not just me, I want you to follow it. Because if you're following it, that means you're going to be treating me fairly, and I want to follow it because really I want to treat others fairly. And I think that's something that's probably within each and every one of us, that we have a desire to follow God's law because we recognize that it really sounds good. We want to follow God's law. Thought number 3, we fail to follow God's law. So here's the idea. We hear God's law and we recognize that it's good, so we want to follow it, but you and I both know that we do not follow God's law, certainly not completely, and definitely not in spirit. Because when Jesus elaborates on God's law, he says that, you heard it said, don't murder, but I tell you, don't even be angry with your brother. That means don't even desire to murder somebody. Don't even desire or wish ill upon someone. And I'm going to tell you the truth. There have been times, I know you won't believe this, but it's true. There have been times where I have desired for bad things to happen to other people. You wouldn't never think that, but I have thought that before. I have failed to follow God's law because I have not had His Spirit of justice, kindness, goodness, mercy. Instead, I've had a desire for getting my own way. So even though I recognize that God's law is good, and I recognize that I want to follow God's law, I fail to follow God's law because I'm selfish. Those 3 thoughts come from our reading today, which is Exodus 21 through 24. If you'd like to read through the Bible with me, join my Facebook group, Through the Bible, where we are reading through the text of Scripture together.